Montana, the wettest spring in recorded history. While the rest of the state watched the weather forecasts and prepared evacuation routes, one Navy SEAL watched the river that had been carving deeper into its banks every single day, the river that was beginning to look less like a contained waterway and more like a wound. Marcus Cole stood on the ridge above Bridger Falls, Montana, a town of about 200 people nestled in a narrow valley that hadn't seen a catastrophic flood in 83 years. That was the problem. No one in town remembered what the water could do. Marcus did. He'd spent 23 years in the Navy SEALs learning to read terrain the way most people read books, identifying vulnerabilities, seeing patterns in the land that revealed themselves only to those trained to look. And what he saw in this valley terrified him. The river was angry. It had been angry for 3 weeks, ever since the mountain snowpack began its spring melt earlier than usual. The winter had dumped record amounts of snow across the western peaks, and now, with May temperatures climbing and the forecast calling for more rain, the valley was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The river's current had accelerated to a roaring freight train. The water, typically a deep emerald green, had turned the colour of wet concrete, suspended sediment from the eroding banks upstream. Marcus could see the damage from where he stood. Trees that had stood for 50 years were now toppling into the current like sticks, uprooted by the pressure of water against destabilized soil. He wasn't alone on that ridge. Next to him, perfectly alert, stood Coda. Coda was a large male German shepherd with a classic black saddle coat pattern over rich golden tan fur, tall pointed erect ears, alert dark amber eyes, a thick dark brown leather collar with a tarnished brass tag, and a distinctive small tan patch above his left eye. The dog had been with Marcus for 5 years, since Marcus had retired from active service and retreated to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Coda didn't understand water dynamics or erosion rates or the failure points of riverbanks, but the dog understood Marcus. And when Marcus was worried, Coda knew it. The dog stood motionless, watching the water, his ears rotating toward every new sound the river made. The roar of the current, the crack of breaking branches, the occasional thud of a tree hitting the canyon walls. Marcus and Coda had come to this ridge dozens of times over the past 2 years, but never with this specific purpose. This time, Marcus was measuring something. He had his hand-marked map, the one with the coloured pencil notations he'd made every day for the past month, tracking how much the riverbanks were eroding, where the water pressure was greatest, where the canyon walls were weakest. He had the topographical map from the USGS, marked with his own calculations about the volume of water the gorge could contain at peak flow. And he had something else, a problem that was burning in his chest like acid, the knowledge that this valley was about to experience a disaster that would change everything. Marcus had lost his wife, Sarah, 2 years earlier. Cancer. 42 years old, gone in 14 months of slow diminishment. They'd had no children, and after Sarah's death, the ranch house they'd bought together in Bridger Falls had become a monument to emptiness. He'd sold it and bought the cabin on the property line, a smaller place that demanded less from him, a place where he could exist rather than live. Coda had been his anchor then, a living, breathing responsibility that got him out of bed in the morning. The dog didn't care about grief or guilt or the particular ache that comes from losing your forever person. Coda just needed food, water, and a walk. The walks had led Marcus into the valley. The solitary rambling had led to observation. The observation had led to this moment, standing on a ridge in late May, understanding something that no one else in the town below appeared to grasp. They were in mortal danger, and they didn't even know it. Marcus had approached the town council 2 months earlier. He'd attended a meeting, nervous and uncomfortable in his civilian clothes, surrounded by people he'd come to recognize over his 2 years of isolation. He'd brought his maps, his calculations, his hand-drawn diagrams of the erosion pattern. He'd explained, with as much humility as he could manage, that the river was approaching a critical failure point. He'd suggested they implement a controlled spillway system immediately, before the spring melt reached its peak. He'd even offered to help engineer it, to donate his labour and expertise. The council had been polite, sympathetic even. But they'd also been dismissive. The river had been fined for 83 years. There was no historical precedent for catastrophic flooding in Bridger Falls. The wettest spring in recorded history didn't mean it would be bad enough to cause flooding. The river could handle it. Besides, any major engineering project would be expensive, and where would the funding come from? The meeting had ended with the council chair, Jennifer McAllister, patting Marcus on the shoulder and saying something about how they appreciated his concern, really, but not to worry. Marcus had walked out of that meeting and directly to the ridge with Coda, and that was when the real plan began to take shape. He'd been trained by the United States Navy to solve problems under pressure, to engineer solutions with limited resources, to execute a plan despite skepticism from superiors. The town council might not believe him, but they would see what he could build. The dam idea had come to him fully formed one night while he lay awake in the cabin, Coda snoring softly at the foot of the bed. A dam at the narrowest point of the canyon, upstream of town. Not a traditional dam. He didn't have the resources or equipment for that. But a structure of stone and timber, built in the traditional style of military engineer corps, designed to redirect the worst of the floodwater into a controlled spillway channel. It would reduce the volume of water reaching Bridger Falls by at least 40%. It would slow the water's velocity by forcing it around a wider angle. It would buy the town time to respond if the worst happened. The next morning, Marcus and Coda had hiked to the canyon site, a narrow gorge about 2 miles upstream of the town, where the river cut between two steep stone walls. He'd examined the geology, the depth, the width. He'd walked up and down the canyon walls, Coda picking his way carefully along the rocky terrain beside him. He'd analysed the best construction point, the least geologically active section, the place where the canyon walls were strongest. He'd done calculations in his cabin, filled entire notebooks with measurements and structural diagrams. He'd studied old military engineering manuals from his SEAL days, books on dam construction, guides to mortar chemistry, and timber beam stress calculations. And then, on a grey morning in mid-April, without telling anyone, without asking permission, without expecting the work to ever be appreciated, Marcus and Coda began to build. The construction started with site preparation. Marcus cleared a working area at the narrowest point of the canyon, moving loose rocks and debris, creating a level base where he could work. Coda stayed close, watching, sometimes picking up a small stone and dropping it where Marcus was working. Not helpful, but present. The dog seemed to understand that something important was beginning, something that required both of them. Stone selection was the first real task. Marcus needed specific stones, larger rocks from the riverbed and the surrounding canyon walls, stones dense enough to bear weight, large enough to be load-bearing, with flat faces where possible. He worked systematically, testing each stone with his hands, feeling for cracks or flaws, rejecting thousands of pounds of unsuitable material for every section that would make it into the actual structure. He found the best stones were the grey river stones, stones that had been tumbled by centuries of water flow, their surfaces worn smooth by millennia of movement. These stones were dense, stable, and ancient. The timber for the frame came from the deadfall pine trees scattered throughout the surrounding forest. Marcus had sections of dead pine already selected before he started the dam project. He'd been collecting and storing them over the winter, wood that had already been killed by pine beetles, wood that was dry and ready to work. He spent 3 days felling additional trees, carefully selecting the straightest specimens, the trees with the least effect. Coda watched these operations with intense focus, and on the second day of tree felling, the dog actually helped. When Marcus was positioning a large trunk to cut a section, Coda planted himself against the log's opposite side, preventing it from rolling. The dog had somehow understood the problem and responded to it without command. Marcus stood still for a moment, looking at his dog, and then continued his work with something like wonder in his chest. The mortar was critical. Stone alone would not hold against water pressure without binding. Marcus mixed clay from a deposit he found on the riverbank with sand and water, working it with his hands and a shovel for hours, testing the consistency, adjusting the ratio. He added a small amount of Portland cement, a calculated risk using materials that technically shouldn't be there in a natural structure, but necessary for durability. The mortar had to be sticky enough to bond, thick enough to fill gaps, and strong enough to hold when exposed to water pressure and temperature fluctuations. He mixed batch after batch, learning through trial and error what consistency worked best, how quickly it set in the spring air, how water-resistant it became as it cured. The actual construction began in late April. Marcus worked from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week, with 1 day of rest where he and Coda would walk the ridge, and Marcus would let his body recover. He started with the foundation, the base layer that would bear the weight of the entire structure above it. He placed the largest stones first, positioning them with mathematical precision, using a level and his military training to ensure they were perfectly horizontal. Each stone had to be stable on its own. He tested each one by pushing with his weight, ensuring it wouldn't shift. Then he applied mortar between them, filling the cracks and gaps, using a tool to smooth it so water couldn't pool in the seams. As he worked upward, he incorporated the timber beams. These were his engineering masterpiece. At intervals calculated by the stress load the water would create, he would lay a timber beam horizontally across the width of the canyon, using mortared stones to hold it in place. The beams distributed the water pressure vertically, preventing any single point of failure. The timber was old and would eventually rot, yes, but water-soaked timber lasted longer than people assumed, and by the time the wood degraded to a critical point, hopefully someone in the town would have built a proper dam to replace his work. Coda was present for every phase of construction. The dog didn't help with heavy lifting, he wasn't that kind of working dog, but he did something perhaps more important. He was there. When Marcus was exhausted, when his hands were bleeding from stone cuts, and his shoulders were screaming from hours of physical labour, when the doubt crept in about whether he was actually building something, or just wasting his time in a futile gesture that no one had asked for, Coda would rest his head against Marcus's leg, or curl up in the shade nearby, and the dog's presence seemed to say something like, "This is what we do. We work. We stay. We see things through." The spillway was Marcus's answer to the problem of water flow. As he built the main dam wall to a height of 12 feet, he simultaneously carved a channel into the canyon's eastern wall, a wide, shallow overflow path that would allow water to bypass the dam if the flow got too high. This spillway was lined with carefully placed flat stones, creating a smooth surface that water could flow across without causing erosion. It would redirect excess water away from the town, channeling it through a wider, more dispersed path down the valley. It was an elegant solution. The dam would hold back some of the water, and the spillway would handle the rest, working together as a system rather than a single point of resistance. By mid-May, the structure was nearly complete. The main dam wall stood at 12 feet, spanning 40 feet across the canyon's narrowest point. The mortar had cured to a grey-white colour, and the timber beams were clearly visible as dark lines running horizontally through the stone. The spillway channel was finished, lined with stones ready to carry water. Marcus stood back from his work one afternoon, Coda sitting beside him, and for the first time in the weeks he let himself believe it might actually work. That was when the town discovered what he'd been doing. The discovery came from Tom Bradley, who owned the ranch that backed onto the forest, where Marcus had been cutting trees. Tom had noticed the activity, the clearing in the forest, the missing timber. He hiked up to investigate and found Marcus at the canyon working on the spillway channel, Coda covered in stone dust, resting in the afternoon shade. Tom had stared at the structure for a long moment, his face moving through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, skepticism, and finally something like anger. "What the hell are you doing?" Tom had asked. Marcus had explained as clearly and calmly as he could what the dam was, why he'd built it, what problem it was designed to solve. He'd shown Tom the erosion measurements, the flow calculations, the engineering logic. Tom had listened, and then Tom had left. And within 2 days, everyone in Bridger Falls knew that the crazy veteran living on the edge of town was building a dam across the canyon without permission, without any official approval, and probably in violation of about 15 different environmental regulations. The reaction was mostly mockery. At the diner, people joked about the seal playing in the river. At the hardware store, the owner laughed and said something about how the Forest Service would probably order Marcus to take the whole thing down as soon as they found out about it. At church, someone mentioned it with a tone that suggested Marcus was the kind of veteran who hadn't really left the military mindset, the kind of guy who built survival bunkers and expected the government to collapse. The town council called an emergency meeting. They sent Jennifer McAllister and 2 council members to the dam site to inspect it. Marcus stood there as they examined his work, their expressions shifting from skepticism to grudging acknowledgement that, whatever else was true, Marcus had definitely built something that was engineered, something that was actually well constructed. But their concern wasn't the dam's engineering quality. Their concern was legal liability, If the dam caused damage, if it failed, if it somehow made the flooding worse, the town could be held responsible for his unauthorized structure. The council sent Marcus a formal letter on May 22nd. It stated with bureaucratic precision that they required him to cease all construction immediately and remove the dam within 30 days, pending review by the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was a polite letter, but it was clear. The town council didn't want his help. They didn't believe his analysis. They preferred the devil they knew, a river that had been fine for 83 years, to a structure built by a grief-stricken veteran who, for all their kindness about his loss, seemed to have become a little bit unmoored by it. Coda had been with Marcus when the letter arrived. The dog seemed to sense the shift in Marcus's mood, the small sound Marcus made when he read the official language, the subtle tightening around his eyes. Coda had moved closer, pressing against Marcus's leg, and Marcus had sunk his hand into the dog's fur, drawing something from the contact. Stability, maybe, or just the reassurance that whatever happened, he wasn't actually alone. Marcus did not remove the dam. He had made a calculation, a military decision based on available intelligence. The spring melt was approaching its peak, the forecasts were worsening, and the river was still rising. By the time any official action could be taken, bureaucratic review, environmental assessment, all the proper procedures, the crisis would have passed, or it wouldn't have. The dam would either prove itself necessary, or it would become irrelevant. And either way, he had done what he could. But something changed in those last days of May. The rain increased. The forecast grew more ominous. The meteorologists began using the word catastrophic when discussing the possible precipitation scenarios. And the river that had been angry for weeks, began to look like something almost alive with rage, a force of nature that had been bottled up and was now beginning to break free. Coda felt it before Marcus did. The dog's behaviour shifted in subtle ways. He wanted to walk up to the dam more frequently. He would stand on the ridge and listen to the river for hours, his ears rotating, his body tense. At night, he would pace the cabin, unable to settle. It was as if the dog could sense what was coming, could feel the mountain's readiness to release its collected water in one catastrophic surge. Coda had been trained for search and rescue work in his earlier life, before Marcus found him at an animal shelter and gave him a second chance. That training never fully left the dog. Coda knew the smell of danger. The forecast called for 48 hours of heavy rain starting on the evening of May 27th. By May 28th at noon, the river was visibly higher. By evening, it was a roaring torrent, water the colour of chocolate milk, foam breaking at the surface, velocity so high that it became difficult to hear anything else. The sound of the river at full flood was almost hypnotic, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, a reminder of the casual indifference of natural forces to human concerns. Bridger Falls should have been preparing for evacuation. The town council should have activated disaster plans. Instead, they were calling the National Guard because the bridge over the river on the town's eastern access road had become impassable, and several residents had ignored evacuation warnings and gotten stranded on the far side. The town was cut off, the water was rising, and 40 people in Bridger Falls were about to face what would have been a catastrophic flood if a Navy SEAL and his dog hadn't spent 3 months building a dam that they had been ordered to remove. Marcus watched from the ridge with Coda as the storm hit. The rain came in sheets, so heavy that visibility dropped to 20 feet. The wind howled through the canyon with a sound like an animal in pain. The river, already swollen from 3 weeks of spring melt, began to rise with visible speed. Marcus could see the water level climbing against the rocks, climbing against the dam's face, climbing toward the spillway channel he'd so carefully engineered. He'd made one crucial decision in the dam's design that he'd never mentioned to anyone, because he wasn't entirely certain it would work. He'd built the main dam wall to stop exactly 70% of the expected peak flow. The remaining 30% would be forced into the spillway channel, where it would be redirected at a wide angle, dispersed across a broader section of the valley floor. The water that made it through would still flood Bridger Falls. He'd never believed he could prevent that entirely, but it would arrive at ankle depth instead of the 8 feet that the calculation suggested a full flood would bring. 8 feet was catastrophic. 8 feet meant houses would be destroyed, people would die, the town would be fundamentally changed. Ankle depth meant displacement, damage, loss, but not death, not annihilation. The rain increased as the night came on. Marcus stood on the ridge with Coda, both of them soaked, both of them watching the river reach levels none of the residents below had ever seen. The dam face was under tremendous pressure now, water hitting it with a force that made Marcus acutely aware of exactly how much weight was being restrained. The mortar he'd mixed would either hold or it wouldn't. The timber beams would distribute the load or they wouldn't. The stones he'd selected with such painstaking care would resist, or they would crumble. At midnight the peak came, the river surged to its absolute maximum, a wall of water that hit the dam with an audible impact, a sound like a physical blow. Marcus felt it in his chest, in his teeth, a vibration that seemed to travel through the earth. Coda barked once, a short, sharp sound of alarm, and then pressed against Marcus's legs, the dog's fear and trust somehow coexisting in that single gesture. The dam held, but it wasn't just holding passively. Water was pouring across the top and down the spillway channel with astonishing force and volume. The spillway Marcus had engineered was exactly what was needed. The water that overtopped the main wall found its path of least resistance and flowed into the channel, where the flat stone lining allowed it to cascade at an angle that redirected it away from the town centre. The result was precisely what Marcus had calculated: a controlled dispersal of water, power reduced by distribution, volume reduced by redirection. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning. The river remained at catastrophic levels, but the dam held and the spillway system worked. By dawn, it became clear to everyone in Bridger Falls what had happened. The water that reached the town came as an ankle to knee-deep flow, cold and powerful but not lethal. Basements flooded. First floors of some buildings sustained damage. A few homes were partially destroyed, but the 40 people who had either ignored evacuation orders or had no way to leave the far side of town, the ones who would have been swept away by an 8-foot wall of water, lived. They walked through the water to higher ground. They climbed onto roofs and waited for rescue. They survived. The second day of the flood was when people began to understand. Someone noticed the dam. Someone walked up to the canyon in a break in the rain and saw it still standing, saw the water flowing around it and through the spillway, saw that the whole system was working in perfect harmony with the river's force, rather than trying to resist it completely. Word spread. The dam that the town had ordered Marcus to dismantle had just saved them. By the time the water began to recede on May 30th, the entire town knew. Jennifer McAllister from the town council came to the dam site with tears streaming down her face and thanked Marcus, who was standing there covered in mud and thoroughly soaked and looking exactly as exhausted as a man who had stood watch over his creation for 36 hours straight. People came in their vehicles as the roads became passable, coming to see the structure, coming to understand what had been built. The hardware store owner brought coffee and thermoses. Tom Bradley brought dry clothes. A minister from the church came to pay respect to a work that had saved lives. Coda had not left the ridge in those 36 hours. The dog was soaked, muddy, his golden tan fur matted with dirt and debris, but his eyes were still alert. The dog seemed to understand that something had been achieved, some essential protection had been maintained. When people came to thank Marcus, Coda would lean against the man's leg, present and steady as if to say, "We did this. Together." The media arrived on May 31st. Local news, then regional news, then national outlets. The story of the Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd, the dam built in defiance of town orders, the structure that had saved the town from catastrophe, it resonated. News crews interviewed people in town, filmed the dam, filmed Marcus standing beside it with Coda. They wanted him to talk about his military service, about his training, about the loss of his wife, and how that had led to this moment of redemption. Marcus gave brief interviews, uncomfortable in front of cameras, preferring to let the dam speak for itself. He did not seek credit. He did not seem to want recognition. But recognition came anyway. The Army Corps of Engineers arrived within a week, and their assessment was remarkable. The dam, built without any formal engineering training, built from materials at hand, was structurally sound. It had performed exactly as one would want a flood control structure to perform. The spillway design was, in their professional opinion, elegant and effective. They recommended that the state work with Marcus to formalise it, to add some reinforcement where appropriate, but to maintain the essential design. The dam would stay. Bridger Falls held a ceremony on June 10th, once the water had receded and people could assess the damage. The damage was real, homes destroyed, livelihoods disrupted. The town would take months to recover. But everyone understood with absolute clarity that it would have been exponentially worse without the dam, without Marcus, without Coda. At the ceremony, they gave Marcus an award. The town presented him with a plaque that would eventually be mounted at the canyon, marking the dam as a historical structure. People shook his hand. Children wanted to pet Coda. The same Jennifer McAllister who had sent the formal letter ordering him to remove the dam stood beside Marcus and publicly apologized, publicly thanked him, publicly acknowledged her mistake. Marcus accepted the thanks quietly. He held the plaque and looked uncomfortable with all the attention. When it was over, he and Coda walked back toward the cabin, back toward the solitude that had been his refuge after Sarah's death. But something had shifted. The grief hadn't disappeared. Grief doesn't disappear, it just becomes part of the background radiation of a person's life. But it had transformed into something else. Purpose, maybe. Connection. The knowledge that his isolation had never been just for himself. It had been preparation for something, though he hadn't consciously understood that until the moment the river tested his creation. The dam became part of Bridger Falls' identity. Visitors came to see it. People brought their children to explain how engineering and preparation could save lives. The story spread beyond the town, beyond the region, becoming part of a larger narrative about veterans, about the skills the military teaches, about the value of taking seriously what others dismiss. But for Marcus and Coda, life returned to something like normal. They still took walks on the ridge. They still hiked to the canyon sometimes, where Marcus would do small maintenance work on the dam, adjusting a stone here, reinforcing the mortar there, keeping his creation in working order. The dog still stayed close, still seemed to understand that there was something sacred about the space between the canyon walls. One afternoon in late June, Marcus stood at the dam with Coda, watching the river flow at normal levels, watching the water pass around the structure and through the spillway with casual indifference. Just water moving downhill as water does. Coda was resting in the sun, the mud and debris washed from his coat, his golden tan fur gleaming. The dog's eyes were closed, but his ears rotated occasionally, tracking the sound of the river, that sound that had become familiar. Marcus thought about Sarah then. He thought about how she would have liked this outcome, how she would have liked knowing that his grief had transformed into action that saved lives. He thought about how the isolation that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning. He thought about Coda, who had been there for every moment of the building, who had stood watch during the flood, who had stayed loyal when no one else believed. The river flowed on, the dam held. Bridger Falls was safe, and a Navy SEAL, once lost in the wilderness of grief, had found that sometimes the only way through loss is to build something that matters.